My name is Steven Druker. I'm a public interest attorney. I'm an expert on the risks of genetically engineered foods and the governmental fraud that has allowed them to enter the market and permeate our fields and our kitchens. And there really have been frauds. And the FDA's, the United States Food and Drug Administration's own scientists recognize that genetically engineered foods entail unique risks. But their memos, their warnings were suppressed by their superiors who lied in public and said they weren't aware of any information showing that genetically engineered foods differ in any way from other foods. That was the key fraud that allowed genetically engineered foods to be commercialized, but it has had to be supplemented year after year by other frauds perpetrated by eminent scientists and scientific institutions, including the United States National Academy of Sciences and the UK's Royal Society. The risks of genetically engineered foods are real. Eminent scientists have repeatedly warned about them, not just the scientists within the FDA. Several well-conducted studies have demonstrated statistically significant harm to laboratory animals that were consigned to eat the genetically engineered foods, and also there are well-documented problems that have been inflicted upon our environment from GMOs. But last but not least, they're not needed at all. They are not needed to feed the third world. There are several sound studies that have been conducted that demonstrate that small-scale farms using agroecological techniques can outperform industrialized agriculture, even when supplemented by genetically engineered foods. So we do not need it, and it is high risk, and a book that I've written documents all of this very solidly. Genetically engineered foods were created in the hope that they would boost production, that they would reduce the use of herbicides and other pesticides, with the hope that they would be able to create more nutritious food in a way that was going to be at least as safe as conventional breeding. However, experience and extensive testing has shown that genetically engineered foods have not lived up to their promises at all. In fact, they have abysmally failed. They have been, in many cases, reducing yields, certainly not increasing yields as they've been promised to do. And in fact, it's been shown that small-scale farms in the third world employing sustainable agroecological techniques can outperform genetically engineered foods when used in agriculture. They have not reduced herbicide use, they have dramatically increased herbicide use, and that's well documented. They have not been benign to the environment. They've created environmental havoc, herbicide-resistant weeds, many other problems for the environment, a depletion of beneficial soil microbes, among other problems. They have not so far produced foods with enhanced nutritional profiles. And most importantly, they have not been producing food that in a safe manner. In fact, study after study has demonstrated that laboratory animals fed genetically engineered foods have developed serious health problems. These studies have been well conducted. They've been published in peer-reviewed scientific literature. And on the whole, the evidence is on the whole definitely raises serious doubts about the safety of any genetically engineered food. And according to many eminent independent scientists, independent of industry influence, who have studied genetic engineering, reviewed the data, these foods cannot be presumed safe, and they should not have been on the market at all yet. Since 1986, the FDA has been under directives from the U.S. White House to promote the biotechnology industry and to ease the introduction of its products onto the market. That began under President Ronald Reagan, but that promotional policy, which, by the way, the FDA admits it is operating under, that promotional policy has continued from the Reagan administration to the first Bush administration, then to Clinton Gore, then to the second Bush administration, and now it's being pursued just as ardently by the Barack Obama administration. So the FDA is basically has a conflicted mission. They're trying to promote genetically engineered foods while they're also supposed to be regulating them. Now, what we see is that the promotional role has won out and the regulatory role has suffered mightily. The FDA's own scientists conducted an extensive review of genetic engineering and genetically engineered foods in 1991, and they overwhelmingly concluded that genetic engineering is distinctly different than conventional breeding, that the foods it produces entail a different set of risks, higher risks, and that none of them can be presumed safe unless and until it has been demonstrated safe through rigorous testing. Now, they said that's what was required from the standpoint of science. From the standpoint of United States law, that rigorous testing was required anyway. So from the standpoint of federal food safety law and from the standpoint of sound science, as articulated by the FDA's own experts, every genetically engineered food should have been presumed unsafe until demonstrated safe, and the demonstration should have been rigorous. What happened? The FDA administrators, pursuant to their policy to promote genetic engineering and speed the entry of its products onto the market, covered up all of the extensive warnings of its own scientists and lied. They stated that they were not aware of any information showing that foods produced by genetic engineering differ in any meaningful or uniform way from other foods. That's an outright lie. Then they deliberately violated U.S. law by allowing all of these foods onto the market without the requirement of one smidgen of safety testing. So a flagrant lie, flagrant fraud, flagrant violation of law, and shockingly, they've been getting away with it year after year. The time has come to expose this fraud and to topple the whole industry that really rests upon it. There are several well-respected scientific organizations that have come out with similar fine conclusions, as have the FDA's own scientists on the FDA Biotechnology Task Force. One of the foremost is the Royal Society of Canada, that nation's preeminent scientific organization. In 2001, an expert panel of the Royal Society of Canada released an extensive report concluding that genetic engineering could not be presumed as safe as conventional breeding, that it was actually scientifically unjustified to presume that it was as safe as conventional breeding, and that the current methods of testing the foods were inadequate, and that the current regulatory system in Canada and the US and the European Union were inadequate. And they stated, the expert panel in their report, the default presumption for every genetically engineered food should be that the genetic engineering process has caused some unintended disruption somewhere in the organism that could become deleterious to human health, and that to monitor for such unintended and potentially deleterious changes, extensive rigorous testing needed to be done, but that at that time, there were no adequate test protocols even that had been developed, and that situation still exists today. The Royal Society of Canada's report is just as appropriate today as it was when issued. Other organizations that have issued cautionary statements about genetically engineered foods include the Public Health Association of Australia and the British Medical Association. Around the world, there are numerous nations that have taken precautionary stances on genetically engineered foods. And in fact, virtually every nation in the European Union, save one, has prohibited the planting of any genetically engineered crops. Further, there are stringent labeling requirements in the European Union, and because of these labeling requirements and widespread consumer resistance, in effect, there has been a boycott on genetically engineered foods entering directly into the human food supply in Europe. There's a very great difference between the labeling laws in the European Union and the United States, because in the United States, the FDA isn't requiring one smidgen of labeling, and whereas there is meaningful, rigorous labeling in place in the European Union. Now, it's important to add that by law in the United States, by law, genetically engineered foods actually are under stricter regulation than they are in the European Union in terms of food safety. The United States has strictest food safety laws in the world when it comes to genetically engineered foods. It's just they're not being enforced, and in fact they're being violated flagrantly. So if the laws in the United States had been followed, there wouldn't be any genetically engineered foods on the market here, nor would there be any genetically engineered foods on any other world market, because the whole venture would have collapsed back in 1992 when the FDA lied and decided to ignore the warnings of its scientists and to break the law by presuming that all these genetically engineered foods were so safe they could be marketed without a smidgen of testing. If the FDA had told the truth and enforced the law, the whole thing would have been over right there. It never would have gained traction anywhere. The very first ingestible product of genetic engineering caused a major human health problem. In fact, it caused a big epidemic that swept the United States in 1989 and 1990. Dozens of people were killed, at least 80 all told. Thousands were seriously sickened, hundreds of whom remained invalids to this day. Most people do not know that because evidence has been so badly distorted and clouded. But it was a food supplement of the essential amino acid L-tryptophan that was produced through genetic engineering. And the evidence as a whole points strongly toward the genetic engineering process as the key cause of the unusual toxic contamination that caused that epidemic. There's an entire chapter in my book, Altered Genes, Twisted Truth, which documents everything I've just said, which analyzes that epidemic and shows how the facts have been twisted, how even the Food and Drug Administration of the United States and eminent scientists have dispensed disinformation to try to cast the blame away from genetic engineering, but how when one actually sorts through all the facts, the fully documented evidence, then the evidence as a whole not only does not absolve genetic engineering, it strongly points toward genetic engineering as the cause. And a professor, a scientist, a biochemist who was a professor of biochemistry and pharmacology at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota for 10 years. He and his colleagues studied this epidemic thoroughly. They are the experts on it. He was a consultant on that chapter, and he has written that my report on that unfortunate disaster is the most accurate, most well-balanced account he has read. There have been several well-conducted studies on laboratory animals that have detected serious harm to those unfortunate animals that were consigned to eat the genetically engineered foods. These studies were very solidly designed, rigorously conducted. They've been published in standard peer-reviewed journals. So that evidence stands. That evidence is extensive enough to have taken all genetically engineered foods off the market. It's just that evidence has been routinely and viciously attacked by the proponents of genetically engineered food, who have tried to convince people, and fortunately too many cases have convinced the media that those studies somehow don't count, that they weren't solid, that they didn't occur. But the truth is, they exist as published research in the standard scientific journals, and they stand. And they stand as great warnings against consuming genetically engineered foods. In the European Union, although there are labeling laws for GMOs that are directly in the human food supply, there's been a major exception for genetically engineered food that is fed to farm animals. The meat, the milk, and the eggs that come from those animals do not have to be labeled. And therefore, for decades, the population of the European Union has been actually indirectly consuming genetically engineered foods. Now, this could be a serious health hazard. Back in the early 1990s, when the scientists at the U.S. Food and Drug Administration did an extensive review of genetic engineering, the division of the FDA that specializes in the health of farm animals, the Center for Veterinary Medicine, did a review, and the director of that center wrote a strong memo saying that he and the other scientists at the Center for Veterinary Medicine felt that feeding genetically engineered foods to farm animal raised unique animal and human food safety concerns. And he explained not only could the health of the animals be at risk, but there could be residues of harmful substances that were in the genetically engineered foods that concentrate in the tissues or the milk or the eggs of the animals, and that could pose serious health risks to consumers. And he said that they felt there had to be extensive safety testing to make sure that such a situation would be safe. And of course, that safety testing was not required by the FDA. His memo was one of the many memos that the FDA politically influenced administrators suppressed and lied about. But it's a strong warning to the consumers in the European Union. They should read that memo. It's FDA document number 10 on the website of the Alliance for Biointegrity, www.biointegrity.org. No one has to take my word for it. They can read what Dr. Guest wrote directly to his superiors about the risks of GMOs in animal feed. Well, GMOs have been adversely affecting nature in many ways. Because of the heavy use of herbicide-resistant crops, which invited the overuse of herbicide, which did happen, as was predicted years ago, weeds have developed resistance. So there's a major problem with herbicide-resistant weeds in the United States, and it's a serious problem. So that's one problem. We know that waterways have been polluted with debris from genetically engineered crops, and it's been found through studies to be having adverse impacts on various forms of aquatic life. We know that the genetically engineered foods that produce their own pesticide, their roots are exuding this pesticide round the clock in the soil. That is harmful to the beneficial soil microbia. Soil is basically living. It's a complex collection of microorganisms, and the health of the plants depend on the health of those microorganisms and their harmonious interactions. And the health of those microorganisms is being disrupted by several kinds of genetically engineered crops. Not only those that exude their own pesticide, but of course the overspraying of herbicide has had bad effects upon the soil microbia as well. And then of course that has knockoff effects, killing a lot of what would have been beneficial plants that birds or insects eat. They're gone, or there are side effects on animals that eat the insects that are killed by the genetically engineered pesticide. There have not been adequate ecological studies on the full environmental effects. And this should have happened. It didn't happen. Many ecologists were warning about it. And again, my book, Altered Genes, Twisted Truth, documents how the systematic warnings were systematically ignored. Well, first, I think people have to, while thinking globally, act locally, as it is said. And of course, the first thing is protect yourself and your family. Make sure you're not eating genetically engineered foods anymore. And by doing that, you're also having a big influence because you're voting with your pocketbook. By stopping to buy genetically engineered foods, you are sending a message to the producers that their products are no longer as attractive. Because if you multiply that by enough consumers, it actually takes only a small percentage of consumers shifting their buying habits to register big time with food producers, and they begin to shift what they're doing. They see that as a developing trend. They can't afford to be behind, and they need to start making changes. So it doesn't even take 50%. It doesn't even take 30%. It can take as small as 5%, and it makes a big difference. So quickly be part of that 5%. Also, start talking to people. Everybody has a sphere of influence. So start gaining the facts and then spreading the knowledge, spreading the facts. Do it out of love and concern for your relatives and your friends. And then they will talk to people. And this begins to have a major ripple effect. And then the ripples start building on the ripples and they become waves. And before you know it, there is a whole new level of awareness. So don't think how powerless you are. Use the power you have, use it wisely, and start using it immediately. Not only does my book examine genetic engineering from the standpoint of biological science and demonstrate that from that standpoint it's a very unsound endeavor, it also analyzes this venture to genetically engineer our food from the standpoint of information science, from computer science. And from that perspective, it also is found not only to be unsound, but outright reckless and in fact borderline insane, because computer science is the science of studying information systems, and it has learned quite a bit over the last decades about the risks of altering complex information systems. In fact, what computer scientists have learned, what software engineers have learned, is that even if when they're dealing with systems that they themselves have developed, when the systems reach a certain state of size and complexity, they cannot revise them in a safe manner, in a manner that's fully safe and predictably safe. Even the most precise, presumably surgical revision made to a complex software system by the software engineers that designed it and presumably know all of its designed interactions, what we have learned is there are side effects that were not intended, that the systems have become so complex they transcend what could be called a linear system and become nonlinear. And that means in a nonlinear system, you make a change here and it can have an effect somewhere that you didn't intend it to be. You cannot predictably localize the kinds of interventions you're making. So in the case of life-critical software, software that guides an airliner, or software that guides a pacemaker or an X-ray therapy machine, there cannot afford to be bugs. We can't afford that. Human life is at stake. So when it comes to revisions, even the smallest, most precise revision to a life-critical system, software engineers know they have to do rigorous testing after any revision to make sure that there have not been any unintended deleterious consequences. And yet, when the so-called genetic engineers make radical, often uncontrolled, in many ways uncontrolled changes to genomes of living organisms that are far bigger and far more complex, far more nonlinear than even the biggest, most complex human-derived software system, they presume that there will not be any unintended dangerous effects and that they don't really have to do rigorous tests to screen for them. That borders on insanity. And I have interviewed many software engineers over the years, and every time I explain to them what genetic engineers are doing with such deficient testing and such basically irrational presumptions, they're aghast. Because when they realize how markedly, how dramatically what the genetic engineers are doing from what they are doing, and how they have far more reason to be more careful, they can't believe it. They're aghast. And that's why, from the perspective of software engineering, as my book makes the point, my book, Altered Genes, Twisted Truth, what is referred to as bioengineering does not deserve to be classed as a field of engineering at all. It's not bioengineering, it's biohacking. My book, Altered Genes, Twisted Truth, How the Venture to Genetically Engineer Our Food Has Subverted Science, Corrupted Government, and Systematically Deceived the Public, is available throughout the world currently via Amazon as a Kindle book. Soon it will be hopefully available as an iBook and on Kobo as well, and in every other important ebook medium. Within the United States and Canada, it's also available through many different vendors in softcover and hardcover. And in the UK, it is available also as a softcover through Amazon. And it's also available in Europe as a softcover in English. But soon, hopefully within the next year, it will be available in several countries in translations. The website for the book, www.alteredgenestwistedtruth.com, contains resources. It contains the main points of the book. It will be containing the executive summary of the book, chapter by chapter, for free download. It will be containing Jane Goodall's foreword to my book and the introduction to the book, so people can get a good flavor free on that website. Also, if people want to download a wonderful free resource that is really book length itself, they can go to earthopensource.org and download a wonderful resource entitled GMO Myths and Truths. It was written, two of the authors are geneticists. It's a brilliant book. It provides all the information you would need to become convinced and to convince anybody that genetically engineered foods are unacceptably risky and should not be on the market. So that's a wonderful resource too. My book is much more of a narrative story and goes into areas that Myths and Truths does not. And together they're a very powerful combination. But you do not need to buy my book to become really an expert on the risks of genetically engineered foods. That free resource, GMO Risks and Truths, that in itself is sufficient.